A sign from heaven. This is what the Pharisees asked Jesus for in Mark chapter 8, verses 11 through 13. They didn't ask because they believed in him. They came to argue with him, to test him, and Jesus knows it. Verse 12 tells us, "And he sighed deeply in his spirit." The Greek word translated as "he sighed deeply" in the New Revised Standard Version, anastenaxos, a word that appears once in all of the New Testament, suggests a groan, a very deep emotional reaction from Jesus to the Pharisees' request. He then asks them, "Why does this generation ask for a sign?" The answer to this question is implied by Jesus' use of the phrase, "this generation." For example, in Genesis chapter 7 verse 1, Yahweh tells Noah, "Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you alone are righteous before me in this generation." So, this generation is contrasted with righteous Noah. The former is unrighteous, the latter righteous. Similarly, in Psalm 95 verse 10, we read, "For 40 years I loathed that generation and said, they are a people whose hearts go astray, and they do not regard my ways." Later in Mark, the phrase, "this generation," is modified with the words adulterous and sinful in chapter 8 verse 38, and faithless in chapter 9 verse 19. In other words, the current state of affairs is one of wickedness, and the reason this generation requests a sign has nothing to do with their faith, but everything to do with their unbelief. As Robert Gulish noted in his commentary on the Gospel of Mark, for Mark, the Pharisees epitomize this generation who repeatedly refuse to respond to God's overture in Jesus and have the audacity to request a sign, a request that stems from their unbelief. So, does Jesus give them a sign? Welcome to Amateur Exegesis. The parallel passage to this one in Mark can be found in Matthew chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. Flip open your Bible and read it if you want. When you're done, flip it back over to the version in Mark. You'll have no doubt noticed some differences. First, in Mark, it is only the Pharisees who come to him requesting a sign, but in Matthew, it is both the Pharisees and the Sadducees. This is a bit bizarre. Generally speaking, the Pharisees and Sadducees were at odds with one another, rarely aligning on anything. In Mark's Gospel, the Sadducees make only one appearance, in Mark chapter 12, verses 18 through 27. But in Matthew's Gospel, the Sadducees are mentioned 7 times, 5 of which are in connection with the Pharisees. Second, Jesus has no emotional reaction as he had in Mark's Gospel. There's no deep groan from within his spirit, but this is typical of Matthew as he often removes these elements in his redaction of Mark. For example, in Mark chapter 3 verse 5, Jesus is said to have looked around at the people with anger because he was grieved at their hardness of heart. The parallel passage in Matthew 12 verses 9 through 14 lacks any reference to Jesus' anger or his being grieved. Similarly, in Mark chapter 10 verse 14, we read that Jesus was indignant when he saw the disciples prohibiting people from bringing their children to him. The parallel passage in Matthew chapter 19 verses 13 through 15 omits Jesus' emotional reaction. Third, the Matthean Jesus begins with a proverb, which most people learned when they were little. It usually goes like, "Red sky at night, sailors delight. Red sky at morn, sailors be warned." Jesus turns this proverb into a rebuke to his opponents in verse 3. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. Mark lacks all of this. Fourth, in Matthew, Jesus tells them that despite their request for a sign, no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. The sign of Jonah? What in the world is the sign of Jonah? To answer that, we need to look at another passage in Matthew chapter 12, verses 38 through 42. There, the scribes and Pharisees have approached Jesus requesting a sign. But Jesus responds as he does in 16:4, that an evil and adulterous generation requests signs, and that no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. Jesus then explains the meaning of this sign in verse 40. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so, for 3 days and 3 nights, the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth. In other words, the only sign offered to the evil and adulterous generation is that of Jesus' death and resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus, writes the late R.T. France, will therefore demonstrate a correspondence between him and the prophet Jonah, each miraculously freed from death. In Jonah's case, it was a virtual death, but in Jesus' case, it would be actual death. With this information in hand, we can now return to Matthew 16 and its reference to the sign of Jonah. Based on this previous reference in chapter 12, the reference here in chapter 16 must also be to Jesus' death and resurrection, still future events in the narrative. But why does Mark's Jesus tell them that no sign will be given, but Matthew's Jesus tells them that no sign will be given except the sign of Jonah? Is this really a contradiction? Unsurprisingly, there are a number of people who believe that it isn't. For example, in his book with Thomas Howe, the late Norman Geisler wrote that Jesus is saying he wouldn't fulfill the Pharisees' request to give a sign right then and there, and since Jesus' death and resurrection were yet to happen in the Gospel of Matthew, the caveat that no sign but the sign of Jonah would be given resolves any notion of a contradiction. Others have argued that since Mark is abbreviating Matthew's Gospel, that he was simply giving his audience the Reader's Digest version of the story, without the reference to weather or to Jonah. While these attempts at reconciliation may help Christian apologists and their followers sleep at night, they unfortunately miss the exegetical mark. Let me read to you again Mark chapter 8, verse 12. And he sighed deeply in his spirit, and said, Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to it. Now, let's reconsider Matthew chapter 16, verse 4. An evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it, except the sign of Jonah. These are clearly parallel. In both, Jesus refers to their generation, and in both he says that no sign will be given to it. But what appears the same in English is anything but in Greek. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 4, Jesus' statement that no sign will be given to their generation is relatively straightforward Greek. It reads, Kai semeion ou dothesetai aute, literally, and a sign will not be given to it. For a student in his second semester of Koine Greek, this clause is easy points on a translation quiz. You have the subject, semeion, a sign, a future passive indicative verb with a negating particle, ou dothesetai, will not be given, and the feminine indirect object, aute, a third-person pronoun whose antecedent is the feminine genea from the beginning of verse 4. Let's now turn our attention to Mark. When we read in an English translation of Mark chapter 8 verse 12 that Jesus tells them, "No sign will be given to this generation," we are reading a linguistic compromise. Whereas in Matthew chapter 16 verse 4, the Greek was fairly straightforward, a clause complete with a subject, verb, and object. Mark 8 verse 12 is anything but. It reads, "E dothesetai te genea taute semion." Literally, if is given to this generation a sign. Isn't that awkward? Normally, when someone uses the word if, it is usually soon afterward accompanied by the word then. If I go outside in the rain, then I will get wet. In technical terms, an if clause is referred to as the protasis, and the subsequent then clause as the apodosis. Together, a protasis and apodosis make up a conditional sentence. But there's a problem here. Jesus only provides us with half of the conditional sentence, the protasis. The apodosis, it seems, has gone missing. But before we put the apodosis's face on a milk carton, let's consider an example of a conditional sentence which is missing an apodosis from everyday life. That is, the everyday life of a parent with children. Suppose your preteen daughter, who has a predilection for keeping a messy bedroom, continues to ignore your requests for her to clean it, since later that evening you'll be having company, among whom are another preteen girl who will no doubt want to hang in that currently messy bedroom, rather than listen to the adults drone on. "Please clean up your bedroom," you tell her at 10 a.m. on a Saturday. "You need to clean up your room before this evening," you remind her an hour later. "Is your room clean yet?" you ask rhetorically at noon. As you gather up the courage to peer into her bedroom at 1 p.m., you consider the fact that your guest will be arriving in just a few short hours. With frustration and perhaps a deep groan from within your spirit, you fling open the bedroom door and you say to your child, "I swear to you, if you don't get this room clean by 4 p.m., and then walk out, closing the door behind you. Parents with smart alecky children notwithstanding, most kids would not need to hear the apodosis, the then clause of that conditional sentence. They know what will happen if they do not get their room clean now. Something bad. It's unexpressed, but it's not unknown. We call this elliptical, the grammatical term for when a clause is missing elements, but the reader or listener knows how to fill in the blanks. I think this is exactly what's going on in Mark chapter 8, verse 12. Jesus is using an oath formula, albeit one that is elliptical. It has the protasis, but it lacks the apodosis. We find these kinds of elliptical formulas in other literature, including the Septuagint. For example, in Psalm 95, verse 11 in the NRSV, we read, "Therefore in my anger I swore, they shall not enter my rest." But in the Septuagint, we read literally, "Therefore I swore in my wrath, if they enter into my rest." It's the Septuagint's rendition of Psalm 95:11 that the author of the book of Hebrews uses when he quotes this verse in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 11, chapter 4, verse 3, and chapter 4, verse 5. They have the protasis, but lack the apodosis. But the reader knows how to fill in the blanks. So, what are the blanks here in Mark chapter 8, verse 12? For this oath to have any rhetorical effect, the apodosis would have to first be really bad and second, be targeted at Jesus, because, after all, it is Jesus who is refusing to give a sign. So it's fitting that it is Jesus who would face the consequences if a sign is given. Think of Psalm 95:11. It would be silly if the apodosis for "if they enter into my rest" was something like, "I will be super happy." Why? Because the context, God swore in his wrath, not his pleasure. The same is true here. Jesus is obviously not pleased with the request. The apodosis, then, must be something negative. And so, a natural fit for this oath would be something like, "If a sign is given to this generation, then I'll be cursed." Or, as John Donahue and Daniel Harrington write in their commentary on Mark, a modern variation of the formula would be, "I'll be damned if such and such happens." Thus, the construction in Mark is emphatic. No sign, none at all, will be given to this generation. It is now clear why Mark 8:12 and Matthew 16:4 contradict one another. Mark's Jesus offers an emphatic no. Matthew's Jesus offers a weak no, but. This leads us to another question. If Matthew is using Mark, why this particular change? Let's return to the Sign of Jonah. Twice in the Gospel of Matthew do we read about the Sign of Jonah. As we read in Matthew 12 verses 39 through 40, the Sign of Jonah corresponds to Jesus' death and resurrection. So, when the reader of Matthew gets to chapter 16, they already know what Jesus means when he speaks of the sign. Luke also refers to the Sign of Jonah in Luke chapter 11 verses 29 through 32. There, Luke says that, though an evil generation asks for a sign, no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. What follows, though, is more in tune not with Mark 8 or Matthew 16, but with Matthew 12. There are a couple of possibilities as to why this is the case. First, it could be that both Matthew and Luke share another source besides the Gospel of Mark. New Testament scholars refer to this source as Q, an entirely hypothetical document that is extant only in the two books that preserve it, Matthew and Luke. If this is true, then both Matthew and Luke had a tradition wherein Jesus refused to offer any sign except the sign of Jonah. So, Matthew had to make a choice. The story in Q is obviously a different context than the story in Mark, but they have similarities. If Jesus was willing to give the scribes and Pharisees the sign of Jonah in the context of Q, why wouldn't he be willing to do so in the context of Mark? And so, Matthew places the Q material where he does, and in his redaction of Mark 8, alters the text so that it aligns with Q. Another possibility is that Luke wasn't using Q at all because it never existed, and instead had the Gospel of Matthew in front of him. But if Matthew wasn't using Q because it didn't exist, and he didn't base his change to Mark on it, why the change at all? Because Matthew's Jesus is not a fan of oaths, like the one in Mark 8:12. Jesus emphatically states in Matthew 5 verse 34, "But I say to you, do not swear at all." Since Matthew 5 verses 33 through 37 is unique to Matthew, this is either a reflection of Matthew's own creativity or part of a tradition about Jesus he inherited that wasn't part of Q. And if the Matthean Jesus doesn't like oaths, then Mark 8:12 would have had to have been modified. And modified it is. The conditional sentence is exchanged for a rather simpler one. This leaves us with one more issue: the sign of Jonah itself. Why doesn't Mark mention it anywhere? The question is easy to answer. Mark's Jesus doesn't let anyone know about his fate except for the disciples. The first time Jesus lets anyone know what is going to happen to him in Jerusalem is in Mark chapter 8 verse 31, following Peter's confession that Jesus was the Messiah. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. This is the first of 3 predictions about his fate that appear in the Gospel of Mark, The other two are in chapter 9, verse 31, and chapter 10, verses 33 through 34. Each is accompanied by some kind of misunderstanding. In Mark 8, Peter rebukes Jesus for making such a claim. After all, how could the Messiah be murdered? In Mark 9:32, Mark outright tells his readers that they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. And Mark chapter 10, verses 33 through 34 is followed by a scene where James and John request to sit next to Jesus in his kingdom, as if they missed what he had said in verses 33 through 34 entirely. In every scene, Jesus tells only the disciples. But not Matthew's Jesus. He lets even his enemies know that he will be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights, just like Jonah, becoming a sign to them, just as Jonah was a sign to Nineveh. That God keeps his promises, that Jesus is God's Messiah, that you can't keep Jesus in the grave. Mark and Matthew both present Jesus in a situation where he's challenged to provide a sign. But in Mark, he outright refuses, telling the Pharisees, "I'll be damned if I'm going to give you a sign." Matthew, however, will only offer a single sign, the most important sign of all, the sign of Jonah. That is, the sign of Jesus' death and triumphant resurrection. 2 different portraits of Jesus. This shouldn't surprise us. After all, these incongruities are what we are all about on Amateur Exegesis.